Hello and welcome to this presentation for the ANCOLD 2020 online conference. My name's James Thorpe. I'm a senior consultant with HATS Consulting, and along with my co-authors we're presenting on When the Bottom Line Impacts Dam Safety, case studies of commercial realities leading to increased risks. So the bottom line, we'll start with the bottom line. The bottom line is that all projects are constrained by a number of variables, classic ones being time, cost, and scope or resources, and we can't get away from that. There's not going to be an endless bucket of money or bucket of time for projects, and dams and tailings projects are no different. So why this paper? So we've experienced a few instances where project and commercial realities have led to decision making that has impacted dam safety and increased the risks presented by their storage facilities. So these are decisions made on a commercial level rather than technical. And we'd like to improve the focus and appreciation on these commercially born risks rather than the technical ones. Present and analyse these case studies is intended to prompt both owners and consultants just to think about their commercial processes and also their project planning, some of the decisions that are made at the outset. And we're hoping this can be used as a reference point to initiate those discussions and using our key findings where it's considered applicable. The presentation contents quickly cover on the commercial realities of tailings as unique to other projects and water dam projects. The project management principles which form some of the basis of the issues that we're presenting on. An overview of some of the fundamentals relevant to the case studies around commercial contracts, project funding, project delivery models, especially D&C, and roles and responsibilities in these commercial processes. We have 4 case studies we've presented as part of the paper, and some conclusions and findings which we really hope will be useful to people involved in dams, water dams and tailings dam projects. So the commercial reality of tailings is simple. I mean, tailings aren't part of the money-making process for mines. They sit to the side. There's sometimes a little bit of value in tailings, in reuse, but certainly it's treated as a waste product. So the temptation there is for tailings to not receive the same attention in terms of resource, cost, time, these variables I talked about, as compared to other aspects of a mining process. So project management fundamentals, talking about these variables, and really what it comes down to is how they impact quality. So from a project management perspective, quality is really achieving that nice even balance of time, cost and scope. Obviously you're getting your value for the money, but also you're completing it within a reasonable time frame. So in a geometrical sense, that really means that for your project management triangle, it's remaining equilateral. But what's of more interest to us is what happens to quality when time, cost and scope are squeezed. So there must be a minimum acceptable quality, which we presented here as, I guess, the area of the triangle with the dashed line there. So there's only so much that you can reduce the scope of a project until the quality of the outcomes is threatened. And they'll become a bit clearer in one of the case studies in particular. So a few of the fundamentals that form some of the basis of these case studies. So commercial contracts, the negotiations involved in commercial contracts, in a particular example between the designer of a tailings dam and the owner, really is inevitable. We find limit of liability is a very key element of these negotiations. They really can erode critical project schedule when a contract is presented at the start of a project, or even a contract's awarded. Projects awarded without a contract, and then the first steps to then negotiate the terms to get them locked away. So really there needs to be allowance for that, and also to acknowledge the real risks that are presented if you erode a critical project schedule during these negotiations, which can affect some critical aspects such as geotechnical investigations or other design activities. Project funding, so funding for dams and tailings projects, and all projects really, I mean, they generally come from an allocated bucket of money which has been determined at an early stage. Say a concept design is used at the basis of funding for detailed design or even construction in an initial stage. And this generally doesn't allow for flexibility and reactiveness. So if circumstances change, additional data comes to light during a geotech investigation, where does that additional money come from? So there's a preference from an accounting standpoint as well to capitalise costs wherever possible. So an example for a tailings dam is the costs associated with closure can not really be capitalised until they're directly used for closure. So it can be a bit of a disincentive to do progressive closure, which can actually have dam safety benefits earlier on. For the example, if you're buttressing a facility to flatten the slope, you're obviously providing greater stability as well. So the earlier you get that advantage, the better, especially if the dam would be reaching its ultimate level. So accounting issues definitely should not trump dam safety. Project delivery models. The D&C model in particular is a focus of one of the case studies. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the D&C delivery model, where there's usually a lump sum contract awarded to design and construct the dam based on a preliminary design or a tender design. So it can be great for the client because they lock in their funds early. It's lump sum, so it's very rigid, but what it's requiring of the D&C contractor is to come up with a tender design in usually a really crunched time period under a lot of budget pressures, because it's they're spending their own money to do it. They can get a tender award fee, but if they don't win the job, they've just done a design for nothing. So they're under a lot of pressure, which means a few things. Obviously, designs can either be rushed or at least based on limited information and analysis, and that's fine as long as there's some sufficient fat in the construction budget and enough buffer there. So when additional data comes to light, that can be absorbed by the construction contractor. Say, if additional geotechnical data means that a spillway slab needs to be thicker or anchors need to be deeper, that it's still within the allowance of their budget to do that without having to really squeeze the project and find cost savings elsewhere, so they don't overrun. So the case studies presented, there's 4 of them. They're plotted along project timeline there on the screen. So it's really where the decisions were made that's plotted on the timeline there, and where that potential risk was initiated. And I won't go into too much detail of those at the moment. We'll just go through one at a time. So case study 1, this particular one's for an irrigation supply dam that was built under a D&C contract. So I mentioned the prelim design was done under quite restricted schedule and also with limited input data, particularly in the spillway area. Now, what this meant was that the spillway concrete dimensions and ground anchoring were subsequently quite significantly increased during the detailed design compared to the tender design. And that was with the benefit of additional geotechnical data, but also completion of more detailed hydraulic analysis. So without the possibility of a variation, the design had to be optimised, i.e. be less conservative in order to limit that overrun for the contractor based on that underdone tender design. So what's the risk here? So the risk is that the contractor's under a lot of pressure, commercial pressures, without the ability to have a variation for additional quantities. They're going to try and limit those additional quantities as much as possible. So if that is pushed too far, the structure, in this case a spillway, may not have met the functional requirements. The reality is that the result in this risk was tender design under undue time and budget pressures, inadequate input data, but also the cost estimation. So there was a bit of a disconnect between the designer and the contractor to understand what assumptions were made in the design, but also from the design how to establish quantities based on very preliminary basic drawings. So that's where some issues came through as well. If the contractor knew more, then they could have allowed for that with some contingency for certain items. So the lessons here are to consider alternative, more traditional methods outside of a D&C to avoid these risks. But for a D&C, if that's the way to go, then just acknowledge that the tender designs in the schedule need quite a bit of effort to gain that confidence. So they need more time, but perhaps need more budget to do so. And that communication between designer and contractor is really important during the tender design. Case study 2. So this is an interesting one where it was under the traditional delivery model for a tailings dam raise project. By traditional, I mean it was designed, then tendered for construction, then there was construction QA services which were provided by the designer. But the issue with this project was that the procurement process, tendering for the construction, was done without consultation with the designer, without their input. Excuse me. And somehow the decision was made to exclude embankment compaction control testing from the scope, despite it being a key requirement of the specification. So then the contractor was not prepared or resourced to do so, and the designer coming in to then perform the QA role was unable to basically sign off conformance to the specification because there was this contractual change made in the scope of the contractor. So multiple non-conformances occurred and eventual reconstruction of the embankment was required. So the risk there is quite clear. Either inadequate work is going to be done without that compaction control, or the designer's unable to sign it off, so then it can't actually be commissioned. The realities that really led to this were that the lowest cost tender is tempting, especially if there's predefined budgets and commercial pressures. And the lessons are really that any technical deviations from scope like that must be referred to the designer or have adequate in-house staff making these decisions. So that's one of the key findings, is really just having the right people in the right roles making these commercial decisions that can impact dam safety. The third case study is around a very rigid procurement process. So this was at a bauxite mine where residue settlement ponds were reaching capacity, and it was basically due to excess water, requiring a new pump to be procured as a simple solution to manage the water. But because of the procurement process, it wasn't a matter of quickly going and buying this pump and installing it. And the delays meant that the embankment had to be raised in a very ad hoc fashion without design or proper control. So that introduces new risks of embankment instability. So in this case, a plan B was executed in favour of circumventing a procurement process if it was recognised that this high water level in the dam was a serious dam safety risk, and a procurement process should be able to be circumvented to address that risk. Could have been a different story. The reality is that a procurement process is necessary. There must be a process to manage the quality of equipment and services, and also uphold integrity and control expenditure. So it's a reality that process is required. And there's a duty to abide by the process as a part of company procedures. So people making these decisions aren't going to readily, go around a company procedure, especially if it's very rigid and well established. So the lesson here is, if there's insufficient forward thinking or a previously unidentified hazard that comes up to do with a tailings dam or even a water dam operation, it needs to be addressed by circumventing procurement. So there needs to be an ability to raise either a dam safety incident or a trend that can trigger a process by which procurement can be circumvented, and the decisions need to be made by those who are really responsible for the safe operation of that facility. The fourth case study is around important risk reduction activities, in this case geotechnical investigations being reduced in scope because the project schedule was eroded by lengthy contractual negotiations. So again, this one quite simple. Schedule, there was a very strict milestone that needed to be reached for this tailings dam raise project, and the geotech investigation was on the critical path for that. So when the start was delayed, there was a decision made to reduce the geotech scope and also run it in parallel to design, so that if there were any changes required to design based on new data, it would be done at the construction phase. But this obviously introduces additional risks of having to have that parallel work and then also impacting the construction process as well. So we mentioned the risk there. So the realities here are around contractual negotiations being inevitable, but also that schedule is something that's much more easily quantifiable and readily understood compared to dam safety and quality. And the lessons really here are that to have terms of engagement for time-critical projects pre-negotiated, any decisions to delay or reduce scope must be taken in full consideration of overall project risks, and to consider separating projects if key outcomes may not be achieved. So another aspect of this job was that the dam safety review required additional geotech investigations as well, and it was decided to combine those with this raised design project. So the outcomes of that DSR were also threatened. So the conclusions of the paper, really two fundamental issues. One, if there's a misalignment in project quality objectives compared to the commercial objectives of time, schedule, budget, and scope, then these dam safety issues can arise. And if there's a lack of dam safety oriented personnel in commercial decisions, that's another aspect that can cause these risks. Other findings, D&C obviously not always the best, as we've covered. Any project must have adequate technical input at the construction procurement phase. If the designer or technical staff aren't involved, then decisions can be made without understanding the consequences. Any rigid procurement processes must be able to be circumvented where there's a dam safety issue. And the combining delivery of projects, in this case the geotech investigation that I mentioned, care must be taken when doing so. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you in person next year. Thank you very much.